The quiet park. The park was quiet, wrapped in the kind of late-afternoon calm where the air seemed to hum softly, as if holding its breath. Families gathered on the open grass, spreading out picnic blankets and unpacking baskets of food. The faint sound of children's laughter carried on the wind, mixing with the gentle rustle of leaves in the tall trees. It was the sort of place that invited peace, yet for Thomas Whitaker, peace was something he hadn't known for years. He walked slowly along the paved path, his polished shoes clicking faintly on the stone. Beside him, in a wheelchair that seemed far too large for his small frame, sat his 7-year-old son, Daniel. The boy was thin, his skin pale, his blonde hair neatly combed by hands that were always careful to make him appear presentable. His big blue eyes looked out at the park, yet they carried a heaviness, as though the joy around him could never quite reach him. His hands clutched the armrests of the chair, knuckles white, his body stiff as though locked in place. Thomas's life had always been built on order, on things looking right. A pressed suit, a successful business, a beautiful home, and now a young, elegant wife to complete the picture. From the outside, he was a man who had it all. But none of that mattered when he looked down at Daniel. What good was wealth? What good was image, if his little boy could not stand and run like the other children? He leaned down slightly, forcing a gentle smile. "Are you comfortable, Danny?" he asked softly. Daniel gave a small nod. He rarely spoke in public, his words kept inside, like treasures locked in a box no one had the key for. Thomas had grown used to silence from his son, though it hurt him more than he ever admitted. A woman's voice floated from behind, smooth and practiced. "Thomas, perhaps we shouldn't linger too long. Daniel looks tired." It was Elena, his new wife, walking just a few steps behind them. She was tall, graceful, with dark hair swept neatly over her shoulders, her tailored dress hugging her figure in a way that spoke of refinement. She carried herself like a woman born to fit into any high society room, her every gesture deliberate, her smile rehearsed. To strangers, she was the perfect wife and stepmother, devoted and caring. Thomas turned, meeting her eyes. "It's good for him to get fresh air," he said firmly. Her smile flickered just for an instant before returning to its polished form. "Of course," she replied, adjusting her pearl necklace. "I only worry for his health." Thomas nodded but said nothing more. He pushed the wheelchair further down the path, past a row of benches where an elderly couple sat feeding pigeons. Daniel's eyes followed the fluttering birds, and Thomas felt a pang in his chest. He remembered when Daniel was just 2, toddling across the living room carpet, chasing after a toy truck. His legs had worked then. His laughter had filled the house. But after his mother's death, after all the grief and the chaos, Daniel had changed. By the time Elena came into their lives, the boy was already bound to the chair, and doctors offered no clear explanation. Thomas told himself Elena was a blessing. She had been gentle with him during his grief, guiding him back into routines, reminding him of appearances, telling him the world still expected Thomas Whitaker to stand tall. She had slipped into his life with ease, and the world approved. A man alone with a disabled son looked broken. A man with a wife and a home looked whole again. But the truth was, Thomas had never fully understood Elena. As he stopped near a small pond, he noticed a figure sitting alone on the far bench. It was a boy, thin, dark-skinned, his clothes worn and dusty, his sneakers ripped at the seams. He couldn't have been more than 15. His hair was messy, his eyes sharp but tired, and in his hands he held a notebook that looked like it had been written in over and over until the pages were soft and bent. The boy looked up, locking eyes with Thomas for the briefest second, then at Daniel, then quickly back down. Thomas might have dismissed him as another homeless teen drifting through the park, if not for what happened next. As Elena bent over Daniel, fussing with the blanket across his legs, the boy's voice carried softly across the path. He spoke not loudly, but with a firmness that cut through the afternoon air. "Your new wife won't let your son walk." Thomas froze. He turned sharply toward the boy, his hand tightening on the wheelchair handles. "What did you say?" His voice was low, measured, but carrying the weight of warning. The boy raised his head, meeting Thomas's gaze without fear. His eyes were steady, unflinching. "I said, your wife won't let him walk." Elena straightened instantly, her expression smooth, but her knuckles pale against the wheelchair's handles. "Thomas," she said sharply, "don't listen to this nonsense." Thomas's heart thudded in his chest. His instinct told him to dismiss it, just a stranger's wild words. And yet something in the boy's eyes unsettled him. It wasn't the look of someone guessing. It was the look of someone who knew. He stared back at the boy, his voice quieter now, almost strangled. "What do you mean?" The boy's lips pressed together. He glanced at Elena, then at Daniel, then back to Thomas. His jaw tightened. "I mean what I said. He can walk, but she won't let him." For a moment the world seemed to tilt. The laughter of children, the rustling trees, the distant chatter, all faded into silence around Thomas. His hand gripped the wheelchair until his knuckles turned white. He turned toward Elena, searching her face. Her smile was gone now, replaced by a cold mask of control. "Thomas, please," she said smoothly, her tone coated with calmness that only made the moment more sinister. "This boy is clearly disturbed. He doesn't know what he's saying. Let's go." But Thomas's mind replayed every strange moment he had brushed aside. The way Elena always insisted on being the one to dress Daniel. The times she had dismissed physical therapy, claiming it exhausted him. The times he had thought he saw Daniel's foot twitch, only for Elena to step between them, blocking his view. Could it be true? Could his son walk, and he had never known? His heart raced, his vision tunneling as he looked from Elena to the boy. The boy stood now, his notebook clutched in one hand. His voice, though quiet, carried across the path with absolute certainty. "I saw her stop him. I saw her hold him down. I know what she's doing." Thomas felt the ground sway beneath him. He glanced down at Daniel, who stared straight ahead, silent, eyes glassy as though trapped in a world he couldn't escape. And in that moment, Thomas realized something terrifying. His son wasn't silent because of his condition. He was silent because of fear. Whispers of doubt. Thomas walked through the rest of the park in silence, pushing Daniel's wheelchair, yet his mind was no longer in step with the calm scenery. The boy's words clung to him, heavy and poisonous, settling deep into his chest like smoke that refused to clear. "Your wife won't let your son walk." It replayed again and again until every sound around him felt muffled. Elena walked beside him, her movements as graceful as always, her expression carefully composed, but he noticed the way her hand trembled slightly as she smoothed her hair back behind her ear. For the first time since meeting her, Thomas thought he saw cracks in her perfect exterior. He had always considered her poised, refined, and elegant, but now he wondered if that elegance was a mask and if behind it there was something colder, something he had never dared imagine. Daniel sat stiffly, staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the armrests as though holding onto an invisible truth. The silence between father and son was no longer simple. It was suffocating. Thomas wanted desperately to reach down, to ask him, "Danny, is it true? Can you walk? Has she stopped you?" But the words caught in his throat. He told himself he couldn't ask in front of Elena. Not here, not now, not with people in the park who might overhear. And yet, another truth gnawed at him. He was afraid of the answer, afraid of what it might reveal not only about Elena but about himself, about the father he had been these past years, blind to his own son's pain. By the time they reached the car, Thomas's heart was heavy, but Elena was quick to regain control. She helped Daniel into the back seat, tucking the blanket around his legs with the same meticulous care she always displayed, her movements gentle and practiced. But now Thomas looked at her hands with suspicion. What once seemed nurturing now appeared calculated, as if every touch was a way of reinforcing control. She slid into the passenger seat with a polite smile. "It was a lovely walk, wasn't it?" she said, her tone smooth, as though nothing unusual had happened. Thomas didn't reply. He gripped the steering wheel, staring out the windshield, the boy's voice echoing in his mind. He could not let it go. That night, after Daniel was put to bed and Elena retired early with the excuse of a headache, Thomas found himself pacing the study. The room was lined with shelves of old books and leather-bound ledgers, the smell of polished wood filling the air. This was the place where he often found clarity, yet tonight no amount of order in his surroundings could calm his storm. He replayed every detail he could remember of the last few years, the endless doctor's visits that led nowhere, the quiet acceptance that Daniel would never walk again, the relief when Elena took charge of the boy's care and told him not to worry. How many times had he let her speak for Daniel in front of the physicians, insisting the exercises were too painful, the treatments too harsh? He had nodded then, trusting her instincts, grateful for her steady guidance. Now he wondered if that trust had been his greatest mistake. As the hours stretched, Thomas recalled moments he had dismissed before. Once, about a year ago, he had walked into the nursery unexpectedly and seen Daniel standing next to the bed, wobbling on weak legs, only for him to collapse back into the chair when Elena appeared suddenly in the doorway. He had assumed it was a trick of memory, or perhaps his hope playing tricks on his eyes. Another time, a physical therapist had remarked that Daniel's muscles were not nearly as deteriorated as expected for a child so long in a chair. Elena had quickly ended the session, claiming Daniel was fatigued, and Thomas had not pressed further. Now those small inconsistencies returned like ghosts, haunting him with the possibility that he had been blind. The next morning, Thomas drove Daniel to school. Elena had insisted on handling the drop-offs ever since their marriage, but today Thomas volunteered, claiming he had business in the area. She gave him a long look, her smile a little too tight, but agreed. When they arrived, Thomas bent down before his son and looked him in the eye. "Danny," he said softly, Are you happy?" The boy blinked, his lips parting slightly, but he said nothing. His eyes darted toward the building, then back to Thomas, then quickly away, as though he wanted to speak but could not. The silence felt like a plea, a whisper louder than words. That afternoon, when Thomas returned to pick him up, he noticed Marcus again, the homeless boy from the park. He stood near the edge of the school fence, his clothes no cleaner than before, his face thin but alert. He approached cautiously as Thomas wheeled Daniel back to the car. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, "I wasn't lying yesterday." His voice carried a weight far beyond his years. "Your son can walk," but she stops him. Thomas's instinct was to silence him, to protect his world from collapse, but something inside him shifted. He looked around quickly. Elena wasn't there. He leaned closer to Marcus. "How do you know this?" he demanded, his voice sharp but hushed. Marcus hesitated, his eyes flicking to Daniel, then back to Thomas. "Because I saw it before, where she used to live. She did the same to someone else. And I've seen your boy move when she's not watching. She tells him he's weak. She makes him believe he can't. But it's not true." The words hit Thomas like thunder. If Marcus was telling the truth, then Elena's care was not care at all. It was control, a prison disguised as kindness. He wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a desperate boy, but the conviction in Marcus's eyes was undeniable. This wasn't a guess. It was knowledge. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He walked quietly into Daniel's room, the moonlight streaming through the curtains, casting pale shadows across the floor. Daniel lay in bed, his small frame curled beneath the blanket. Thomas sat gently on the edge of the mattress, brushing a strand of hair from his son's forehead. "Danny," he whispered, his voice breaking, "if you can walk, if she's stopping you, please, you have to show me. I'll believe you." But Daniel only squeezed his eyes shut tighter, as though the very thought terrified him. Thomas sat there for a long time, torn between love and guilt, anger and fear. The boy he adored. It might have been trapped not by illness but by manipulation, and the woman he trusted might not be the savior he thought she was. The perfect life he had built, the perfect image, suddenly felt like glass, ready to shatter with one undeniable truth. As he left the room, he caught sight of Elena standing at the end of the hallway, her figure half hidden in shadow. She was watching him, silent, her eyes unreadable. For the first time, Thomas felt a chill when he looked at her, as though the home around him was no longer safe. The boy who saw too much. The following days passed in an uneasy haze, each one heavy with a tension that refused to lift. Thomas found himself studying every small interaction between Elena and Daniel, watching with a sharper eye than ever before. He noticed things he had once dismissed, The way Elena insisted on being the one to lift Daniel from his chair, even when he squirmed slightly in resistance. The way she always adjusted his legs beneath the blanket, her hands firm, almost forceful, her voice soothing but carrying the weight of command. She often told Thomas not to worry, that Daniel was fragile and needed rest, but now those words sounded less like comfort and more like control. Thomas wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but he hesitated. He knew his world was built on appearances, and a confrontation would tear that image apart. Meanwhile, Marcus kept appearing at the edges of Thomas's days. The boy seemed to exist in the background like a shadow, outside the school, near the park, at the corner by the grocery store. Always in worn clothes, always carrying that battered notebook, always watching. At first, Thomas thought it coincidence, but after the third or fourth time, he realized Marcus was waiting for him. Finally, one late afternoon, Thomas parked the car after dropping Elena at a luncheon and found Marcus sitting on the Saint-Tung. EPS of a closed shop, knees drawn to his chest, his gaze steady. For reasons he couldn't explain, Thomas walked over. "Why are you following me?" he asked quietly, his voice more tired than accusing. Marcus looked up, his dark eyes calm but unflinching. "Because you need to know the truth," he said simply. His voice carried no anger, no desperation, only conviction. "I know what she's doing. I've seen it before." Thomas felt his breath hitch. "What do you mean before? You don't even know my wife." Marcus shook his head. "Not now, not this name. But years ago, before she became who she is now. She lived in my neighborhood. I was just a kid, but I remember her. She was with a man who had a daughter. That little girl could walk, but Elena, she told everyone the girl was sick, told her she was too weak to stand, told her that moving would hurt her. And after a while, the girl believed it. She stopped trying. She sat in a chair all day, just like your son. I saw Elena holding her down once when she tried to get up. I never forgot it." The words landed like stones in Thomas's chest. He wanted to deny them, to argue, to call Marcus a liar. But something in the boy's tone stopped him. It wasn't the frantic claim of someone seeking attention. It was the flat, steady voice of someone who had carried a truth too heavy for too long. "You're telling me my wife has done this before?" Thomas asked, his voice low, almost trembling. Marcus nodded. "Yes, and if you don't stop her, your boy will never walk again. She wants him weak. She wants him dependent. That way, she controls both of you." Thomas staggered back a step, his hand pressing against the wall of the shop as if to steady himself. His mind reeled. Elena's care, her constant presence, her insistence that Daniel was too fragile. It had all seemed like devotion. But now, through Marcus's words, it looked like chains. Could it be true that the woman he had trusted with his son's life was the very one keeping him bound? He forced himself to breathe deeply, to collect the fragments of his reason. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice rough. "You're just a boy. Why should you care what happens in my house?" For the first time, Marcus's expression softened. His gaze dropped for a moment, then lifted again, and when he spoke, there was a quiet pain in his words. "Because I know what it's like to be silenced, to be told you can't, to be made small. I won't let it happen to him, too." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He had judged Marcus by his appearance, by the dirt on his clothes, by the fact that he slept on park benches and lived without a home. But in that moment, he saw the boy differently. Marcus carried himself with a dignity that came not from comfort but from survival, from fighting to be seen in a world that looked past him. That night, Thomas returned home unsettled, his heart heavy with Marcus's words. He sat in his office staring at the fire flickering in the hearth, his mind pulled in two directions. On one side was loyalty, the belief that his wife could not be capable of cruelty so deliberate. On the other was doubt, fed by memories, observations, and now Marcus's haunting story. Elena entered the room quietly, carrying a tray with a glass of wine. "You work too hard," she said gently, placing the glass on his desk. "You need to trust me more. I worry about you, Thomas. You should let me carry the burdens." Her words, once soothing, now made his skin crawl. He looked at her perfect hair, her flawless smile, her calm tone, and he wondered how much of it was real. Was she caring or was she rehearsing? Was she protecting him or manipulating him? He thanked her softly, but inside his doubts deepened. Later, when the house had fallen silent, Thomas crept to Daniel's room. He found his son awake, staring at the ceiling, his small chest rising and falling with shallow BC breaths. Sitting beside him, Thomas whispered, "Danny, I need you to tell me something. Can you move your legs, even a little?" Daniel's eyes flicked toward him, wide and fearful. Slowly, under the blanket, Thomas felt a faint twitch against his hand, so small it could have been imagined, yet real enough to bring tears to his eyes. The boy quickly stilled, glancing toward the door as though expecting Elena to appear. Thomas leaned closer, his voice breaking. "It's all right, son. You don't have to be afraid. I'm here. I'll protect you." But Daniel only turned his face to the wall, his silence louder than any scream. For the first time in years, Thomas felt powerless. He was a man who could command boardrooms, who could shape entire industries with his signature, yet here in the quiet of his own home, he could not free his own son from invisible chains. The realization shook him to his core. He knew then that Marcus was right. Something was terribly wrong. Daniel's silent plea. The morning sun spilled through the tall windows of the Whitaker estate, gilding the rooms in warm light that felt unearned. Thomas sat at the breakfast table with a newspaper spread before him, but his eyes did not move across the print. He was listening instead, listening to the small sounds from the kitchen where Elena guided Daniel's breakfast routine. He heard the scrape of a chair, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, Elena's soft voice instructing, correcting, controlling. "Sit properly, Daniel. No, don't try to reach for that. Let me help you." The tone was sweet, but to Thomas's ears, it was no longer the voice of a caretaker. It was the voice of command, disguised in gentleness but firm enough to clip the wings of a child who might otherwise try to fly. When Elena wheeled Daniel into the dining room, the boy's eyes immediately sought his father's face, and in that brief moment, Thomas thought he saw something desperate flicker there, a silent plea hidden in the depths of blue eyes too young to carry such It was as if Daniel was begging him to see, to understand, to act. The sight pierced Thomas more deeply than any accusation from Marcus had. For the first time, he felt as though his son's silence was not a barrier but a message, and it was his own blindness that had failed to read it. The day passed in uneasy fragments. Elena busied herself with errands, leaving Thomas and Daniel alone for the first time in days. It was a rare opportunity, one Thomas knew he could not waste. He led his son to the garden, wheeling him along the stone path to a quiet corner where tall hedges shielded them from view. There, under the shade of an oak tree, Thomas crouched before the chair and took his son's hands gently in his own. "Danny," he whispered, his voice steady but urgent. "I need to know the truth. You don't have to be afraid. Can you move your legs?" Daniel's small hands tightened around his father's fingers. For a long moment he remained frozen, his eyes wide, darting toward the house as though Elena might appear at any second. Then with a trembling effort he shifted beneath the blanket. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but Thomas felt it. The faint push of muscles long denied their freedom. His heart leapt, tears pricking at his eyes. The boy could move, he could. The truth Marcus had spoken was no longer a rumor, it was reality. "Good boy," Thomas murmured, overwhelmed. "I believe you. I promise I'll protect you." But Daniel only shook his head weakly, his lips parting as if to form words that never came. The fear in his eyes was too great, the silence too heavy to break. That evening, as Thomas stood at the edge of the driveway watching the sunset bleed across the horizon, a voice startled him. "He can move when she isn't looking, you know." Thomas turned sharply. It was Mrs. Green, the elderly neighbor who lived across the street. Her silver hair was pinned back neatly, and she leaned on a cane as she approached. She had always been friendly in passing, a woman who tended her garden faithfully and exchanged pleasantries, but now her eyes were sharp with purpose. "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, his voice tight, already knowing but needing to hear it from someone else. Mrs. Green sighed. "I've seen him, Thomas, more than once. When Elena leaves the room, I've watched from my window. Your boy shifts in that chair, even stood once. Just a step or two, but enough to know he isn't as helpless as she claims. But the moment she comes back, he goes still, like he's been caught doing something forbidden. She paused, lowering her voice. I didn't want to interfere, but when I saw that homeless boy talking to you at the park, I thought you should know you're not imagining things. The weight of her words pressed hard against Thomas's chest. Confirmation, from someone who had no reason to lie, no reason to meddle, except genuine concern. His doubts were no longer shadows. They were substance, undeniable and terrifying. He thanked Mrs. Green quietly, his voice shaking, and returned to the house with a storm brewing inside him. That night, Elena moved about the home with her usual composure, never once betraying the possibility that her carefully constructed world was crumbling. She poured wine, legs, ucked lightly at a story she told about her luncheon, and smiled as though nothing was amiss. But Thomas could not look at her the same way. Every gesture seemed rehearsed, every word calculated. He saw in her now not the partner he had once believed her to be, but a woman who had built her place in his life with precision, who maintained control with invisible strings tied around both him and his son. When Daniel was tucked into bed, Thomas lingered in the hallway listening. He heard Elena's voice inside the boy's room, low and firm beneath its gentle tone. Remember, darling, you mustn't try to move on your own. It will hurt you. You're too fragile. You need me. The words chilled him, for they were not comfort, they were chains. Chains spoken in lullabies, chains disguised as love. Later, when the house was quiet, Thomas stood alone in his study, staring into the flames of the fireplace. The truth pressed against him from all sides now, undeniable and suffocating. His son was capable of more than he was allowed to show. His wife, the woman he had trusted with their lives, was keeping them both in a prison built of lies. The neighbor had seen it. Marcus had warned him. Daniel himself had whispered it with every frightened glance, every twitch of his legs, every silence that spoke louder than words. Thomas realized he had reached a breaking point. He could no longer sit in the comfort of doubt. He had to know the full truth. He had to see it for himself, undeniable, unfiltered. He had to witness what happened when Elena thought no one was watching. And so, with a heavy heart and trembling hands, he began to plan. The confrontation. The house had grown colder, though the autumn had not yet reached its deepest chill. Thomas felt it in every corner, every shadowed hallway, every quiet room where Elena's presence lingered like perfume masking a deeper rot. For days he had moved cautiously, saying little, hiding the storm that brewed inside him. But within that silence, a plan was forming. It was no longer enough to harbor suspicions. He needed proof. Proof that could not be denied, not by Elena's smooth words, not by society's blind approval, and not by the part of himself that still longed to believe he had chosen wisely in marrying her. He began by observing with deliberate care. At the breakfast table, he let Elena guide Daniel's hand to his spoon, insisting the boy could not feed himself, though Thomas saw the flicker of frustration in his son's eyes. At therapy, Elena spoke over the doctor, saying Daniel tired too quickly, that his muscles could not endure the exercises, even when Thomas noticed a spark of determination on his son's face. At night he lingered outside Daniel's room, listening to Elena's soft but firm voice, planting words that sounded like love, yet bound like chains. You're too weak, darling. Daddy doesn't understand, but I do. You need me. You always will. The pieces fell into place with every passing day, until Thomas felt as though he were living in two worlds, the one Elena displayed with perfection and the darker one beneath, where a little boy's spirit was being quietly suffocated. One evening, after Elena had left for a late dinner with her social circle, Thomas called Marcus into the garden. The boy appeared almost at once, stepping out of the shadows as if he had been waiting. His thin frame was outlined by the porch light, his notebook tucked beneath his arm. You were right, Thomas said quietly, his voice heavy with the admission. I've seen. Enough now to know you weren't lying. She's doing it. She's keeping him from trying. Marcus nodded, not triumphantly, but with a weary acceptance. I told you. She wants him dependent. That way you'll always need her. It's not about the boy, it's about control. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. But why? Why would she do something so cruel to a child? The boy's gaze was steady, unflinching. Because control feels like power to people like her. If he learns he can walk, he won't need her. And if you see the truth, you won't need her either. The words cut deep. Thomas realized he had been blind not just to Elena's actions but to his own vulnerability. He had let grief, loneliness, and the desire for order cloud his judgment. He had wanted a partner so desperately that he had ignored the signs, handed her the keys to his life, and in doing so, placed his son in chains. "I need proof," Thomas said firmly, his jaw tight. "If I confront her with only suspicion, she'll deny it, twist it, make me doubt myself again. I need to show the world what she's doing." Marcus hesitated, then slowly opened his notebook. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, sketches, fragments of memory. He flipped to a section where rough drawings showed a younger girl in a chair, a woman's figure standing over her. "This is what I saw years ago," he explained. "I wrote it down because I didn't want to forget. People said I was just a kid imagining things, but I knew. I saw her stop that girl from standing. I saw the fear in her eyes. The same fear your son has now." Thomas took the notebook, his hand trembling. The sketches were crude, the words uneven, but the truth they carried was undeniable. For years, Marcus had borne witness to Elena's cruelty, first as a powerless child, now as a boy hardened by homelessness, yet still unwilling to let another suffer in silence. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice breaking with sincerity. "You've carried this burden too long. I promise you it won't be wasted." The next step was harder. That night, Thomas installed a small camera in Daniel's room, hidden among the books on a shelf. He hated himself for it, hated the invasion of his son's privacy, but he told himself it was the only way. He needed to see, to hear, to know beyond all doubt. For 3 nights he waited, reviewing hours of footage that showed nothing but ordinary routines. Elena reading bedtime stories, adjusting blankets, humming soft lullabies. He began to wonder if his suspicions were driving him mad. Then, on the 4th night, he found it. The footage began as usual, Elena tucking Daniel into bed, smoothing the covers, her smile tender. But then, as she leaned close, her voice dropped, its sweetness edged with steel. "Remember, Daniel, you mustn't try to move. You'll only hurt yourself. You're too fragile. You need me. Don't let Daddy trick you into thinking otherwise. He doesn't understand." Thomas's breath caught as he watched his son's small face tighten, his eyes filling with tears he refused to let fall. Under the covers, his legs shifted slightly, a movement Elena immediately noticed. Her hand pressed down firmly on his thigh, pinning him in place. "No, darling," she whispered, "don't. Stay still. That's better. Good boy." The sight made Thomas's stomach turn. Proof, undeniable proof. His wife was not protecting his son. She was imprisoning him. The next morning, he could barely meet Elena's eyes. She moved about the house with her usual composure, pouring coffee, discussing her social calendar, reminding him of the charity gala that weekend. But all Thomas could see was the woman in the recording, her hand pressing down on his son's leg, her voice weaving chains in the dark. His resolve hardened. This could not continue. The time for silence was over. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house settled into its nightly rhythm, Thomas called Marcus to the back door once more. The boy entered cautiously, his eyes scanning the grand interior as though it were a world he did not belong in. Thomas handed him the footage. "I have proof now," he said, "but I'll need your help. She's clever, and she'll try to turn everything against me. You've seen her before, Marcus. You know how she operates. Together, we'll bring the truth into the light." Marcus nodded solemnly. "I'll stand with you." For him. He glanced toward the hallway where Daniel's room lay, his expression softening. He deserves to walk. He deserves to be free. For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt something stir inside him, a glimmer of hope piercing through the fog of fear and doubt. The battle ahead would not be easy. Elena would not surrender her control without a fight. But now he had proof, he had an ally, and he had the truth on his side. As he closed the door behind Marcus, Thomas looked up the grand staircase toward Daniel's room. His son's future no longer seemed like a question shrouded in silence. It was a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The confrontation was coming, and this time Thomas would not look away. Truth in the open, The night of reckoning arrived quietly, as though the house itself sensed the storm to come. The Whitaker estate stood bathed in moonlight, its grand windows glowing faintly against the velvet sky. But inside, the atmosphere was heavy and sharp, like a wire stretched to its limit. Thomas had not spoken much throughout the day. He had moved through the house with the silence of a man consumed by thought, his mind rehearsing, recalculating, reminding itself that hesitation could no longer be afforded. He had the proof hidden safely on a drive in his pocket, and he had Marcus's words burned into his conscience like scripture. Yet proof meant little if he lacked the courage to face what it revealed. Elena floated through the evening as though nothing had shifted. She greeted him with her elegant smile, poured wine into crystal glasses, and spoke in that perfectly measured voice about the gala she was preparing for. The guest list, the gowns, the applause she expected. She spoke as though their lives were flawless, unmarred by shadows, and Thomas watched her with a mixture of disbelief and dread. How had he let himself be fooled by the ease of her grace, by the way she could command a room with poise, by the reassurance she wrapped around him when he was broken? He had mistaken control for care, manipulation for loyalty, performance for truth. And tonight, he was going to tear that mask away. It began after dinner, when Daniel had been tucked into bed, and the house fell into its nightly rhythm of silence. Thomas stood in the study, his hand resting on the desk where he had laid out the small drive containing the footage. He called Elena in with a tone sharper than usual. She entered with her usual grace, but her brow furrowed faintly at the look on his face. "Thomas," she said, her voice dipped in false concern. "What is it? You look pale. Has something happened?" He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down," he said flatly. She hesitated, then lowered herself into the seat, crossing her legs with deliberate elegance. "You're frightening me," she murmured, though her eyes glinted with suspicion more than fear. Thomas leaned forward, his voice steady but burning with the anger he had held back for too long. "I know, Elena. I know what you've been doing to my son." For the first time, the mask faltered. A flicker crossed her face, so quick another man might have missed it, but Thomas saw. Her smile returned at once, thin but polished. "Thomas, you sound absurd. Daniel is fragile. Everything I do is for his health, for his comfort. You know that." "Don't," Thomas cut in sharply, slamming his palm against the desk. The sound echoed through the room, startling even himself. "Don't you dare stand there and pretend you're protecting him. I've seen the recordings. I've heard the words you whisper to him at night. You tell him he's weak. You tell him he cannot walk. And when he tries, you stop him. You've been holding him down, Elena. You've been chaining him in silence." Her composure faltered again, her lips parting slightly before pressing into a thin line. She shifted in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests. "You placed cameras in our home?" she asked coldly, avoiding his accusation by focusing on his methods. "Do you realize how that makes you look? Spying on your wife, violating trust." "Trust?" Thomas roared, his voice reverberating against the study walls. "You want to talk about trust? I trusted you with my son's life, and you used that trust to control him, to break him, to turn him into a prisoner. That boy is 7 years old, Elena. 7. And instead of helping him heal, you've been feeding him lies so he'd believe he was broken." Her eyes flashed with something sharp, something darker than denial. For a moment the polished elegance stripped away, and Thomas saw the woman beneath, the cold, calculating will that thrived on power, not love. She leaned forward, her voice lowering to a hiss. "Do you know why he listens to me, Thomas? Because he needs me. Because I give him certainty. You, with your grief and your endless doubts, you left him vulnerable. He needed strength, and I gave it to him. He obeys me because he knows he cannot survive without me." Thomas's heart pounded, but a strange calm settled over him. The truth was laid bare now, spoken not by Marcus, not by Mrs. Green, not by a hidden camera, but by Elena herself. The woman he had invited into his life, into his son's world, had admitted it. Control was her gift, and power was her aim. "You're wrong," Thomas said quietly, his voice low but resolute. "He doesn't need you. He needs freedom. He needs to believe in himself, not in your lies. And I swear to you, I will not let you hurt him any longer." For the first time, Elena's eyes wavered. Her mask of confidence cracked just slightly, revealing the flicker of fear beneath. She rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "If you try to take me out of this house, Thomas, you'll regret it. You'll destroy the image you care so much about. What will people say when they learn you married a woman you couldn't even control? They'll see weakness in you. They'll pity you, and you hate pity more than anything." But Thomas only shook his head. "I'd rather be pitied for the truth than praised for a lie." The silence between them stretched long and sharp. Elena stood rigid, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, her elegance collapsing into fury. Thomas remained seated, his shoulders heavy but his resolve unshakable. For the first time, he felt stronger than her, not because of appearances, but because he had chosen truth over image. The confrontation did not end with screaming or violence. Instead, it ended with a fracture, an unbridgeable divide that both of them understood could never be crossed again. Elena left the study without another word, her heels clicking against the marble hallway with precision. But Thomas knew the sound was hollow now. Her reign was broken. That night, Thomas sat outside Daniel's room, listening to the soft breaths of his sleeping son. For the first time in years, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Hope that his boy could be freed, that his silence could be broken, that the chains Elena had placed around him could finally fall. But he also knew the battle was not finished. Elena would not walk away quietly. She would cling to her image, to her control, to Titi Chant, the power she had built. The truth was in the open now, but the fight for Daniel's future had only begun. A new beginning. The days that followed the confrontation were heavy with silence, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of a storm that had finally broken and left behind the wreckage. Elena moved through the house with clipped grace, her every movement sharp, her smiles brittle, her words fewer. She no longer whispered to Daniel at night, no longer hovered at his side with controlling hands, no longer wrapped her authority in sweet tones of protection. But she also no longer carried the warmth of a wife or a stepmother. She was a shadow moving through rooms, her presence tolerated but unwelcome, her hold shattered by the truth Thomas had unearthed. Within Thomas, a strange clarity began to grow. For years he had clung to order, to the appearance of a perfect life, believing that image was the same as strength. But the mask had been ripped away, and what lay beneath was raw and real. He was a man who had failed his son in his blindness, a man who had chosen comfort over truth, but he was also a man who could change, who could fight, who could rebuild. And now he knew with certainty that Daniel's future mattered more than reputation, more than wealth, more than the polished veneer of society. The first test came when Thomas arranged for Dr. Patel, the pediatric specialist, to visit unannounced. Elena tried to protest, but Thomas cut her short with a firmness she could no longer bend. "This is my son," he said simply, "and I will not let him live one more day in lies." When Dr. Patel examined Daniel, Thomas watched closely, his breath shallow with anticipation. At first, Daniel sat stiffly, his small body tense, his eyes darting nervously toward Elena. But Thomas knelt beside him, taking his hand in his own. "It's all right, Danny," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. I know the truth. I've seen it. You can try. You can—" For a long moment, the boy remained frozen. Then, slowly, with trembling effort, he pressed his feet against the floor. The muscles in his legs quivered, unsteady from disuse, but they responded. Inch by inch, he lifted himself, wobbling as though the earth beneath him were shifting. His knees bent, his arms clutched for balance, and then, finally, miraculously, he stood. Thomas's vision blurred with tears. Dr. Patel gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth while Elena turned sharply away, her composure cracking as the truth she had buried came alive before her eyes. Daniel's face flushed with effort, his lips parted, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, a sound broke from him, a single word, whispered with trembling strength. "Daddy." The world seemed to stop. Thomas pulled him into his arms, clutching him tightly, his body shaking with sobs that refused to be contained. "I'm here, son," he whispered over and over. "I'm here. I'll never let anyone hurt you again." You're free now. You're free. That moment shattered whatever remained of Elena's power. Within days she was gone, retreating into the world she valued most, the world of polished appearances, of parties and social circles where she could still wear her mask. She left without ceremony, without farewell, as though slipping out of a life she had never truly belonged to. Thomas did not chase her. For the first time, he felt no fear in letting go. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm began to form. Therapy resumed with renewed vigor, and Daniel, though unsteady, grew stronger with each passing day. The chair that had once been his prison became only a tool for moments of rest, not a symbol of incapacity. His silence, once heavy with fear, began to break into small words, then full sentences, until laughter returned to his voice like sunlight after rain. And Marcus, once only a shadow at the edge of their lives, became something more. At first he refused Thomas's offers of shelter, insisting he could manage on his own. But Thomas saw in him not just a boy hardened by the streets, but a survivor, a protector, a witness who had carried a burden too great for his age. With patience and persistence, Thomas convinced him to stay, offering him a room, a bed, and above all, the belonging he had been denied. Daniel, shy at first, began to follow Marcus around the house, mimicking him, smiling when he cracked small jokes, looking up to him like an older brother. And Marcus, who had once stood alone in the cold, now found himself part of a family bound not by blood, but by truth and courage. One evening, months later, the three of them stood in the garden together. Daniel, now walking with halting but determined steps, crossed the grass while Thomas and Marcus watched. The boy stumbled once but caught himself, his eyes shining with pride. Thomas felt his chest swell with emotion as he turned to Marcus. "If not for you, I might never have seen the truth," he said quietly. "You saved my son's life." Marcus shook his head, his voice steady. "No, he saved himself. All I did was make sure you looked." The simplicity of the words struck Thomas deeply. It was true. Daniel had carried the strength all along. It had only been buried under lies and fear. And Marcus, a boy society had cast aside, had been the one to see clearly when others refused to look. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in hues of gold and crimson, Thomas realized that a new chapter had begun, not one defined by appearances or masks or silent prisons, but by resilience, truth, and love. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but they no longer held power. They were simply reminders of a story rewritten by courage. For the first time in years, the Whitaker estate did not feel like a house trapped in silence. It felt like a home. And in that home, a father, a son, and a boy who had once been forgotten by the world stood together, bound by the promise of freedom and the certainty that no lie, no mask, no chain of control would ever hold them again.